Hi there. Emmy and I are just coming out of our COVID quarantine, and Liam's over there too. And we're happy to record some more videos for you, some video lectures. And today we're going to be talking about criterion measurement. Yes, chapter 4 is about criterion measurement. And let's get right to the overview. Now, the overview may look relatively simple, but there's a lot of information that we're going to cover in this chapter. First, we'll define the criteria as well as its properties. Next, we'll chat about various criterion problems. There's one criterion problem that the book kind of says there is, but there's multiple problems with the criterion. So we'll go into that a little bit, and then we'll distinguish between different types of performance criteria. So what we're going to do first, actually, is get started with a clip from the Great British I can say words. The Great British Bake Off. I'm too used to lecture breaks. Anywho, so I'll probably get copyright hit when I put this up on YouTube. But what I'd like you to do now is pay attention to these three bakers. I think his name is Ceci. Tom and Kate. In particular, I'd like you to think about their performance. So how did each of the bakers perform? What information did you use when making this assessment? So write down, whatever down, some specifics, and we'll reflect on those a little bit right after the clip. So here we go.
For their first challenge, the bakers could practice. But the technical challenge is a complete surprise.
Bakers, welcome back to an afternoon of misery and stress, otherwise known as the technical challenge. This is one of Mary's recipes. Now, you judge this blind, Paul and Mary, so off you go. There is a baking workshop happening. I think, Paul, maybe your bread needs a bit of attention, so off you go. So Mary and Paul would like you to make 12 Viennese whirls. Slightly dizzy. They should be filled with buttercream and jam, and you've got 1.5 hours. On your marks, get set, bake.
The bakers all have the same ingredients. And a very basic version of Mary's recipe.
Probably going to end up shooting myself in the foot now by saying I've made it before. I have made it before.
Viennese whirls, Mary. Where do you think they can go wrong?
The actual biscuit itself has very simple ingredients, but they've got to get that butter really soft when they beat it with the sugar. If they don't, it'll be far too stiff. They'll get it in the piping bag and they won't get it out.
You do want to see that swirl in the top.
If the mixture's particularly soft, they might have to fridge them before they actually bake them. They're very, very short and crumbly, with a nice proportion of jam. Then you have the buttercream.
It's buttery, it's crumbly, it almost dissolves in the mouth. Absolutely delicious. I think it's a great challenge, Mary. And you've only given them an hour and a half, too.
I think they should do well.
This says make a jam.
They've got this kind of really light consistency, so I think this is probably a very important step.
Fingers crossed.
Nice soft butter.
Right.
We want 24 wells that are 5 centimetres in diameter, and they're a sandwich biscuit, so I want my biscuits to be the same.
It looks the right consistency. There are no lumps in it.
It's a very stiff mixture. It's quite hard to get it a nice, even whirl.
God, I need muscles like Celeste to pipe these.
I just need to give it a bit of a beat, just to soften it up a bit.
45 minutes remain to finish their 12 Viennese whirls.
It's nice and easy. Second piping attempt.
I'm going to go and put these ones in the fridge so they chill and hold their shape a bit better.
Just says bake, it doesn't say chill. So I'm just going to bake. I'm going in.
I'm going to start them off for 9 minutes.
All right, bakers, half an hour on the Viennese rolls. Half an hour on the Viennese rolls.
200 grams of icing sugar and half a teaspoon of vanilla extract. They're not looking too bad.
Happy with those?
They look all right, they're kept well.
Oh God, are these even cooked? Slightly flat.
To be honest, most of them are.
They've collapsed and very crumbly.
Flat. Sandwich with jam and piped buttercream.
It's going to be messy. Oh, there's another one gone.
Not good. Not good at all.
This is just crumbled.
Bakers, 1 minute. Okay, bakers, it's time, please, to bring your Viennese whirls and place them behind the photograph of yourself on the gingham altar.
Mary and Paul are looking for 12 perfectly piped, melt-in-the-mouth Viennese whirls filled with raspberry jam and buttercream. They have no idea whose are whose.
Got a few,
I know what you're going to say, issues.
yeah, there are a few issues, a few problems. First one. Now, there's no definition in the biscuit at all. Beautifully delicate, melts in the mouth.
It tastes good. We don't have the definition. We've got really good definition on these. We can see a swirl of the pipe.
You can see the buttercream inside it as well.
They're very good.
Now, this one's gone very slack. Its whole thing's collapsed.
And also, it affects the flavour. It's a little bit oily, isn't it?
It is. That one's...
Mary and Paul will now reveal whose Viennese whirls were technically perfect.
In 11th place, who is this? We've lost definition and it was a bit crumbly.
10th spot is this one. It's gone really flat.
Michael is 9th, Candice 8th, Tom is 7th, Rav 6th, Val is 5th, and Andrew is 4th.
And in 3rd place here, we've got a good definition.
In 2nd spot is this one. Who's this? That's a nice Viennese whirl, well done.
And so in 1st place, absolutely beautiful. Well piped, we've got a lovely definition, just the right amount of jam and cream. Well done.
So I've watched this clip actually quite a few times. I've never experienced as much anxiety as I just did when that lady blew the powdered sugar off of her plate. The same sort of discomfort that I feel when I see people shaking hands in TV shows. I've been pre-programmed to think that's wrong. So anyways, let's reflect for a minute on what you wrote down, what makes a good baker. Now, look at your list, and you probably wrote down things dealing with the process of what a good baker does, right? So, placing the cookies in the fridge or the Viennese whirls in the fridge, being organized, proper piping of the biscuits, all sort of these behaviors that they engage in. In contrast to process, you probably wrote down some things about the outcome itself, so the quality of the Viennese whirls. So the appropriate amount of buttercream and jam, the definition of the biscuit, some nice swirls, things like that. In this case, the criteria that the judges were judging them on was the latter bit, right? The aspects of the outcome. They weren't really being assessed on how they did things, but the final outcome, for which Paul and Mary had a clear set of standards to evaluate the bakers on fairly and consistently, hopefully. And that's what a criterion is, right? This set of standards to evaluate the employees fairly and consistently. So if you wrote down anything dealing with the process, that's still good. That just wasn't the criterion in this case. You can have these sets of standards about how things get done as well, and that could be performance criteria. But in this case, the only criteria that they were looking for was the quality of the cookie or biscuit or whatever you call them at the very end. Now, I've kind of gone back and forth about, using the terms criterion and performance, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But, if you're looking for more formal definitions, criterion are evaluative standards that can be used as yardsticks for measuring an employee's success or failure. So it's used often in appraising employee performance, which is next week. Next day, I don't know, whenever you're watching this, it's the next one. Training program evaluation, selection, validation, layoff, promotion decisions, etc. And performance is typically defined as the actual behaviors that are relevant to the organization's goals. All right, let's just cut to me. I have something to say.
I forgot what I was supposed to say. In general, the criterion that IO psychology... In general, the criterion that IO psychologists are most interested in is performance. So job performance, the behaviors that determine whether or not an employee is successful or fails. And so throughout this lecture, I'll be using the terms criterion, performance criterion, and performance interchangeably. So with that said, let's start to think about the characteristics of criterion. So if we know what a good baker is, how do we get at that? How do we determine what are the behaviors that are indicative of a good baker? And I'm gonna stop now because my kids are doing stuff they shouldn't be.
That's because we can't always measure everything. The definition of a good baker hinges on our ability to create a clear ultimate criterion, which composes of all of the aspects of success on the job. The issue with the ultimate criterion is that it's theoretical, complex, and usually unachievable. Hence, we tend to shoot for assessing things like the actual criterion. So where it's the best real-world representation of the ultimate criterion. And the reason why we use this is because it's usually measurable and achievable. And it also focuses on the most important aspects of the ultimate criterion, not measuring or getting at the minutia. Here's just a quick example for you all to look over for a minute. So some of these things within the ultimate criterion are either inconsequential or difficult to measure in the real world. This is for a baker, and it looks like I removed, let's see, can I get the laser pointer? There we go. I removed the knowledge of appropriate oven temperatures and ability to roll, knead, and shape the dough, or cut or shape the dough. All right, 7.5, right? But those things seem pretty important. You could probably measure them too. So that really begs the question, what makes a criterion good?
So in 1984, some researchers thought it'd be a good idea to determine 25-ish characteristics that would indicate a good criterion. But
ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time. Ain't nobody got time. Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time. Ain't nobody got time. Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time for that. Ain't nobody got time. Ain't nobody got time. Ain't nobody got time for that.
So we're just going to talk about 5 today. Specifically, we're talking about reliability, So we're only going to talk about 5 today. Specifically, we're going to be talking about relevance, reliability, sensitivity, practicality, and fairness. This is heavier than I thought.
So the first up is criterion relevance. And so say we have this ultimate criterion here and the actual criterion. And when we move them together, like a nice little Venn diagram thing here, the middle bit, there we go, is the criterion relevance. So it's the things that we want to get at. And so say right here in the actual criterion, this bit is the like what our measure of the criterion actually gets at, and this is the theoretical construct of ultimate criterion, and this bit in the middle here is what our measure is getting at in the ultimate criterion. So this is the relevance, that overlap between the actual and ultimate criterion. However, there are these little bits on the outside here, and there's nice little names for those as well. So right, the stuff that we're not getting at with our measure are criterion deficiency. Right, so these are the things that are missing from our actual measure. It's things that we may want to get at, but aren't getting at. Now, this could be either on purpose, because we don't think they're measurable, and we may not think they're important, or it could be just by mistake because we may say a bad measure. There's also criterion contamination. So contamination is this little non-overlapping bit here, and it's things that we shouldn't be getting at. So there's always like bad items or something on your measure that aren't really that you shouldn't be getting at, but you are for some reason. Like if your boss says, well, I want to get at grit, which is a big controversial thing in IO literature, and so, but grit is not necessarily part of the ultimate criterion, but because your boss says they want to get a grit, you throw some items in there, whatever. So criterion relevance is basically that middle bit, getting at the things that we want to get at. Criterion deficiency are the things that we're not getting at, and criterion contaminations are things that we are getting at, but shouldn't be getting at. Oh, yeah, so criterion, I forgot about this. Criterion contamination can be from, also from random measurement error, so that you can't really do much about that, or biases. So if the raters are potentially bad, like witnessing something and making bad decisions, which we'll actually get at in the next chapter, some rater errors that they make, and how to fix those too.
Beyond relevance, there's also reliability, which should appear right here. Good job, Dr. Weiss. So, if you remember, reliability is a concept that we learned about in Chapter 2, and reliability caps validity. So if your criterion measures aren't reliable, they sure as ain't gonna be valid. Now, what you're doing when you have an unreliable measure is essentially introducing contamination, which could be a big problem for using your criterion measures.
Next up is sensitivity. Now, I'm not talking about sensitivity in the respect that why Harold here bought his wife some flowers, that he probably, got into a fight, and old people have drama too. They're just, a lot cuter when it happens.
Sensitivity here refers to whether or not your criterion measure can distinguish between effective and ineffective performers. So think of it this way: if Andy Dwyer no, that's Parks and Rec, isn't it? Andy Bernard and Dwight Schrute get the same score in your performance measure, then it's not sensitive at distinguishing between good and bad performers. So it's insensitive.
A good criterion should be practical as well. So imagine a scenario in which you could measure employee through a battery of tests, right? You have some physiological tests that they go through, some physical tests that they go through, some psychological tests that they go through. And at the end of the day, you can predict with 100% certainty whether or not they'll be awesome at the job, and or that the how awesome they're actually doing on the job. And but the downside is that it costs $100,000 to give them this battery of tests. Would you do it? Probably not. And so it's important that your criterion is practical as well.
Lastly, a good criterion is fair, and so fairness means it should evaluate the employee justly, and it should be perceived as such. An illustrative case is what happened in old school firefighting example. So back in the day, firefighters used to be required, well, I mean, they still are required to lift a certain amount of weight, but they had to lift this weight in a very particular way, which was advantageous to men who relied more on upper body strength than lower body strength. So it was not fair to women who who could do that same test, lift the person up and move them a certain amount if they lifted them up in a certain way. And this all went to court, and that's a story for another day. But in the case of those early firefighting tests, that criterion measure was not fair.
Well, now that we have that figured out what a good criterion is, let's throw a stick in the wheel for a second and talk about the criterion problem. Well, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning of the lecture, that's not exactly right. It really should be criterion problems. And there's a couple of them that you should know about. So the first problem that we're going to be discussing now, so the traditional way you think of it, is of the criterion problem, is that performance is a multi-dimensional construct, and these dimensions that you're getting at, so that you're getting at multiple dimensions, or potentially orthogonal to one another. That is, just because you're great at one aspect of the job doesn't mean that you're amazing at all aspects of the job. But there's also the dynamic criterion problem, but we'll go into that in later slides. So let's focus on this traditional definition. And let's take our favorite barista, Holden, for examples. Now, Holden may actually make the best cup of coffee that you've ever had in your entire life. But he says something really rude to you one day for no reason at all, and you just can't stop thinking about it. It's stressing you out. So much so, you start smoking again, even though you promised your wife you wouldn't do it anymore. It's just that what he said is stuck in the back of your head, and you think that one cigarette would give you some sort of respite, a break from his nagging, condescending face, but it really doesn't help. In fact, you just start smoking more on a more consistent basis. Your smoking friend introduces you to other drugs, and frankly, you can't believe this, but you enjoy them. For a brief moment, that scarf-wearing turd nugget is out of your mind, and it's such a relief. You start doing other activities that start taking your mind off this wannabe emo and his soulless eyes. And your wife, she's had enough, and understandably so. She tells you that she's divorcing you. In the mediation meeting, she explains to the divorce lawyer your complete and utter neglect for your family. And when you're around your family, all you talk about is this ginger barista that said something mildly insulting to you. Now, as a hiring manager, would you want to hire someone like holding, if you're really thinking about it. An individual with so little people skills that it may have this irreconcilable, deleterious consequences for your customers? No. And that's basically the Criterion problem in a nutshell. So what are these multi-dimensional factors? Well, it really depends on the job. So these multi-dimensional factors can be related to one another, or they could be very job specific. So there are these things. Campbell came up with this 8-factor model to get at them. So you have these job specific task proficiencies, non-job specific task proficiencies, written and oral communication tasks, demonstrating effort, maintaining poor personal discipline, facilitating peer and team performance, supervision, management, and administration. Now, these are all great. I think that they're actually called the Campbell's Great 8, but I could be misquoting there. But not all of these are necessary for all jobs. Yeah, so all of the ones with the little asterisk here are necessary for all jobs. You need to be proficient at the job that you're hired for. That's probably important. You need to have personal discipline to whatever degrees for all jobs. You need to do the job, and that's demonstrating effort. But all of these other factors are kind of, it really depends on the job that you doing. So here's the rub. What actually happens when you need to make organizational decisions? Like, should I hire this person? Should I promote this person? Should I fire this person? Should this person get a raise? When you have these multiple dimensions of performance, then how do you evaluate everyone equally and fairly? Because these decisions that you're making, and I think I'll talk about this a little bit later, are kind of dichotomous in nature, right? Should I hire this person? Yes or no? Should I promote this person? Yes or no? But it's really hard to do that when you have these multiple potentially unrelated factors. So are they compensatory? Should they all be equal? Well, that's what you have to determine. So there's two different what you want to do is aggregate it into a decision, a yes or no decision, and there's a couple ways that you can do that. So the first way that you want to composite it into like a single decision is equal weighting. And equal weighting is exactly what it sounds like. Each of these individual criterion factors lead equally to a decision. Like, for example, if I'm evaluating a student on whether or not they should be admitted into the program. I give GRE equal weight, I give GPA equal weight, I give their background equal weight, I give their letters of rec equal weight with one another, and so on and so forth. The other way is unequal weighting. And it basically is like, oh, you should give these 3 most important factors more weight than these less important factors, and these might not be factors at all. So, like GRE, fit with the lab and research area, and past research experience might be the ones that I pick. I'm literally off the top of my head. Then I'll look at GPA. Actually, GPA usually doesn't matter. Maybe GPA in the particular discipline, so their psych GPA for me, their personal statement, and so on and so forth. So the weights that you have or that you apply to these different kind of sort of subdimensions are depend on the purpose of the criteria. So, was the decision that you're making raise, promotion, termination, etc. So we have these criterion dimensions right here, and we have 2 different decisions. Criterion weights for promoting to supervisor, and criterion weights for termination. As you can see, you probably are not weighing punctuality very much for promotion to supervisor. Performance matters a little bit. Interpersonal behavior also matters a little bit. Leadership behaviors matter a lot. Computer performance, whatever that means, matters less. And organizational performance, which is totally different than computer performance. Don't take these literally. Just think of it as separate criterion dimensions. Matters less. However, the performance does matter a little bit more here when you're deciding whether or not to terminate someone. Punctuality absolutely matters, and so does their general performance quality. So depending on the decision that you're making, you need to weigh these criterion dimensions differently. It's important to note that, the compositing this criteria may not always be necessary. So if you're making a decision that for economic reasons, then you probably need to combine into one dimension as an index of economic success. But generally, I mean, the stuff that I'm interested in, the stuff that IOs work on, are decisions with a psychological focus. So these should be examined in light of predictors and not combined. So you want to look at those individual dimensions, because if you just aggregate it into one, you can't give feedback, you can't improve, etc. So, for example, it's better to get feedback on, you didn't make the cut this time for the grad program. What was a really deciding factor was your lack of fit, and I got that through your personal statement, right? So I could give feedback on that particular dimension. But if I just aggregate it and don't know why I aggregated it, then that becomes problematic. Well, you need to do better on your application. That doesn't help anyone develop or become a better applicant for a PhD program or a master's program or job or whatever you're looking at.
So that's the first criterion problem, right? That performance is inherently multidimensional, and you're going to have to make decisions that are frankly not, right? You can't say you're going to multidimensionally hire someone or something like that, right? Or promote someone based upon multiple. That's like a dichotomous decision, right? I am going to hire someone or not. And so because performance is multi-dimensional, it becomes relatively difficult. That's why it's the criterion problem. So the second criterion problem is an enemy to us all. It's time. And so imagine this scenario. I hire you as an RA using excellent multi-dimensional selection measures. How long do you think that is going to predict your performance in my lab? Is it going to be 2 months, 6 months, a year? And that's the second criterion problem, that the measures that you use initially may not predict later on, for various reasons we'll get to in a bit.
So there's two ways that you can really think about dynamic criteria. The first is measures reflecting performance levels changes over time. So this is a problem for IO psychologists because the validity of the predictor may deteriorate over time. The most effective employees during the first 6 months are not always the same as those at the end of the next 6 months, so that could be problematic. The other example is that changes in the criterion dimensionality over time. So performance today is not necessarily performance in the future.
Think of it this way. If I hire you as an RA in my lab, you're going to be super excited to do something new and novel you probably haven't done before. But after a period of time, these are really tangled up. However, after a period of 6 months of coding articles, you may realize that this may not exactly be for you. And so in that case, the selection criteria that you use, your enthusiasm for I/O, is no longer a good predictor for doing well on the job. This illustrative case is an example of the performance requirements of the job not changing, but your motivation to do the job has changed over time. So that's a problem. A second case is if you say are my RA for a while, you're doing an excellent job because you're you, and then all of a sudden I think, you know what, you're ready for more stuff, more responsibility. And so instead of just the coding that you've been doing for the last 6 months, I start putting you on empirical projects where the skills and the abilities that you need to do the job has changed. So you're still a research assistant, that's still your job, but the performance requirements of the job has changed over time. And so that's another problem. So the selection instruments that I used you may not predict in the second scenario either. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you to do a little thought exercise. But first, let's have a little lecture break. So a little context for this lecture break. The person that you're about to see is my mom. And she has been studying Kundalini yoga for so many years, since I was a kid. I used to go to a ashram and everything, like the whole 9 yards. And so what she's going to do now is introduce to you a couple breathing techniques. And I hope you enjoy and can take a little break from this lecture.
Balancing the breath, the pranayama. As you do yoga, we like to integrate the breath with the movement, but allowing yourself to hear your breath, allowing yourself to trust it, what usually gives the calming of the mind, the balance of the mind. So gently sit up, close your eyes, and inhale through the nostrils and exhale through the nostrils. As you're breathing, allow yourself the awareness around you. Allow the sounds. There you go. Now to focus onto your breath, if you cannot hear your breath as you bring it in through the nostrils, you'll hear it in the back of the throat as it comes down as you exhale. Take your finger, block your ear, and listen. Now let's find your rhythm for this moment. As you inhale, counting by 1,000 as you inhale, then exhale. Do your next inhale, you don't have to count, and then count your exhale. Take the lowest number, and that is your rhythm for right now. So gently inhale, even if it's 2 seconds. 1001, 1002, exhale. 1001, 1002. Again, listen to the breath, keep the eyes closed, slow the breath down, Allow yourself to become aware. Do the best you can. Breath 2. Balancing the left and the right hemisphere of the brain. This can be done at any time also. As you find your rhythm, or you just do the breath, counting by 1,000. Now you gently block off the right nostril, inhaling through the left and exhaling through the left. The left nostril, it will find to be very calm as you do it. If you're really stressed, this will take a few inhales and exhales. Trust it. If your mind gives you that chatter or that stress, then use a mantra. I personally like using Sat, S-A-T, and as you exhale, Nam. The meaning of it is very simple. Sat is truth, Nam is name. You're tuning in to whom you were created to be. So continue that rhythm for calmness.
All right, as promised, we're going to do a mental exercise. We'll come back from that lecture break. Hopefully you're mentally prepared for this. Now, this mental exercise, I want you to think of a job. Any job that you want. It could be a job that you had in the past, a job you have now, or a job you want to have in the future. Now that you have that job in your head, imagine that you've worked at this job for, I don't know, let's say a year, and you have your annual performance meeting with your boss. What type of things do you think your boss would rate you on? Because these lectures don't allow me to have that sort of awkwardness that happens during the live sessions that we have. I'm going to bring some of that element into this and then sit here quietly for the next, I don't know, like 10 seconds. Beautiful. All right. So what type of things did you think of? Some of the things that you may have thought of are like absenteeism, if you're coming into work, helping behaviors, whether or not you're doing your job, whether or not you're productive, whether you meet deadlines, how efficiently you're meeting these deadlines, your general enthusiasm, how much effort you're putting in, teamwork, all of these things. And a nice way to classify them is the performance criteria. So all of these are within the criterion domain. So all of these are types of performance criteria, all of these things that we just mentioned. So those are the subdimensions that I think we talked about a little bit earlier. And there's a lot here, and there's a lot of different ways to get at them. And so we have this nice little system where we break it down into measurement characteristics. So whether you're getting at these things in an objective way or a subjective way, or the content of what these things mean. So whether or not they're more task related versus contextual related. So what does contextual mean? I think you guys kind of get the gist of this already, but I will go into a little bit more detail, except for contextual. What the hell does that mean? So objective criteria are performance measures based on counting rather than subjective judgments. So hard or non-judgmental criteria. Most typical objective criteria is productivity. So the Vietnamese whirls, the number of them that they made, the objective swirliness of them might be one. I don't know. These are pretty suitable for non-managerial jobs, but not managerial jobs. So here's a couple examples. So absence, lateness, turnover, accidents, grievances, productivity, counterproductive behavior. So these are the sort of things I would ask a live class, and then, oh, great job. You can count the number of absences. That's pretty easy. You can count how late they were per month, or the number of latenesses per month, or anything like that. So like anything that doesn't require some sort of human judgment would be considered objective criteria. Now, if you want to get really deep about it, like what is late, you could we could have a debate on that, but just don't go down that rabbit hole. So subjective criteria are a little bit different, right? It's performance measures based on judgments or evaluations of others rather than objective measures. So what this, I don't know, short video guy was doing was making ratings on people. Typically include ratings or rankings of employees by other employees, supervisors, coworkers, and subordinates. And this is an excellent alternative when objective criteria do not exist, but more likely to be affected by biases, attitudes, beliefs of the rater. And again, we'll get into these biases next class because they're super important. The next little bit is breaking it down by content. So you have these task versus contextual performance criteria. So task is exactly what you think it is, like what you're supposed to be doing at the job. And these things vary a great deal across jobs. You know, a computer programmer is not doing the same thing as a college professor, is not doing the same thing as a worker at McDonald's, is not doing the same thing as a nurse, is not doing the same thing as a medical doctor. These are formally instituted by the organization, the stuff in the job description, and it's usually predicted by things like cognitive ability and past experience. Contextual performance is a little bit different. So these are the activities performed by employees that help to maintain a broader organizational, social, and psychological environment. So, you know, do you like having a good co-working environment? This is more contextual performance. And these are relatively consistent across jobs. They're more informal, part of the individual or part of the culture. You know, as you can see here, task performance is predicted by more ability and experience factors, while the predictors here is kind of like those other characteristics, right? So how conscientious are you? How agreeable are you? Your values and beliefs and like orientation towards teamwork. Those are the things, those little fluffier things are going to predict contextual performance more. So I do want to dig into contextual performance just a little bit more. I hope you do remember the negative thing that Holden said that really got to the customer's core and drove them mad. That was just a couple minutes ago, so hopefully that's still somewhere in your brain. Well, you know, interacting with a customer is part of his normal job performance, right? His task performance, and so that's not good that he was doing it, but because he has a customer-facing job. But let's imagine his sibling. So here's a picture of his sibling. Let's call him Morrissey. He has a non-customer facing job as a web designer. So unlike Holden, Morrissey loves people and goes out of their way to help folks when they're in need. For instance, Morrissey's coworker was super sick, and they picked up some extra work for them to make their coworker's life just a little bit easier. Though, a side note about Morrissey, he does often complain about the food being served at the work cafeteria, but that's neither here or there. When Morrissey engages in behaviors like these helping behaviors, he's engaging in organizational citizenship behaviors. So these are the behaviors that support the social and psychological environment in which task performance takes place.
Oh, good morning. OCPs are becoming increasingly more important. Organizations are looking to assess things that predict people's propensity to engage in pro-social behaviors at work, but there could potentially be a downside to organizational citizenship behaviors. Have you ever worked with someone who tried to help you all the time that really that you didn't need their help, and it kind of got a little bit annoying? Or potentially you're someone who engages in OCBs all the time. Is it draining for you? We're not sure yet. And whether or not there's a dark side to OCBs, I'm not going to tell you because we're going to have a debate on that later on in the semester.
The sort of converse of organizational citizenship behaviors are counterproductive work behaviors. So these are behaviors that somehow harm or detract from the organization. It's like stealing things, withdrawal behaviors, abuse of others, sabotage. It's not exactly the opposite of OCBs. Research has shown they're only moderately related to one another. In fact, they're more strongly related to task performance than OCBs. And they have different antecedents, right? The things that cause you to steal, be a jerk, and break things are not the same antecedents as organizational citizenship behavior. So a lot of the times they're compared as opposite ends of the spectrum, but you can think of them as really two different things. All right, I think that wraps up this relatively short lecture, at least from what I'm seeing here. As a general reminder, discussion questions are due February 15th. We have a synchronous class. That's the review recap class on February 17th. The next debates are on February 22nd. That's also a synchronous class. Be sure to show up. And the quizzes are due on that same debate day. Hope you all have a great rest of your something, and I'll talk to you next time.